Richard and his claim to the throne, it was not necessary for him to kill the princes, the sons of Edward IV, to take the throne.
Two boys, 12 and 9 years old, are seen playing in the Tower of London. Then they vanish forever. Their disappearance in 1483 secured the throne for their uncle, Richard III, and branded him a monster. But many people are crazy about this case because the evidence just doesn't add up. A respected historian spent his final years piecing together a different narrative. Before he passed, he pointed the finger at a completely different suspect, revealing what really happened to the princes. What he found turns the entire Tudor dynasty on its head. A mystery begins. The year is 1483. England is thrown into chaos. On the 9th of April, King Edward IV, a man known for his charm, his military skill, and his huge appetites, suddenly perishes. He was only 40 years old. His passing wasn't just sad, it was a political earthquake. You see, his son and heir, Edward V, was only 12 years old. A child was set to rule a kingdom full of powerful, ambitious, and ruthless men. King Edward IV knew this was a problem. In his will, he named his most trusted brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector. Richard's job was simple: travel from his base in the north of England, meet the new boy king, and protect him until his official coronation. Richard was known as a loyal and dutiful man, a stark contrast to his pleasure-seeking brother, the late king. The new king, Edward V, was in the care of his mother's family, the Woodvilles. The Woodvilles were not popular. The old nobility saw them as greedy newcomers who had married into power. The Queen's brother, Anthony Woodville, and her son from a first marriage, Richard Grey, were escorting the new king to London. Richard, the Lord Protector, intercepted them. On the 30th of April, just weeks after the king's passing, Richard and his close ally, the Duke of Buckingham, had Anthony Woodville and Richard Grey arrested. They claimed the Woodvilles were plotting to seize control of the government and sideline Richard. Richard then took charge of his nephew, the young king, assuring him he was safe. They rode into London to cheering crowds. Young Edward V was taken to the Tower of London. Now, this sounds sinister, but at the time it was totally normal. The Tower was not just a prison, it was a royal palace, a fortress, and the traditional residence for monarchs before their coronation. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. But then, things got strange. The late king's wife, Elizabeth Woodville, heard her brother and son were arrested. In a panic, she fled with her other children, including her 9-year-old son, Richard, Duke of York. They claimed sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, a place where they legally could not be arrested. Richard, the Lord Protector, and his council argued this was a bad look. They said the king's younger brother should be with him, playing and preparing for the big ceremony. On the 16th of June, a delegation went to the Abbey. They convinced the Queen to release young Richard of York. The 9-year-old boy was taken to the Tower of London to join his 12-year-old brother. This is the last time anyone can be sure the two princes were seen in public. What many overlooked is that the boys were not prisoners, not at first. They were seen playing in the Tower gardens, shooting arrows and waving to people. But as the weeks went on, they were seen less and less. Soon they were only glimpsed through barred windows. And then, nothing. Just 6 days after the younger prince arrived on the 22nd of June, a sermon was preached outside St. Paul's Cathedral. The preacher, a man named Ralph Shaw, declared that King Edward IV had been secretly engaged to another woman before he married Elizabeth Woodville. In the 15th century, a prior promise to marry was as binding as a marriage itself. This meant his marriage to the Queen was invalid, and if the marriage was invalid, all of their children, including the two boys in the Tower, were illegitimate. They had no claim to the throne. The path was suddenly, shockingly clear. The only person left with a legitimate royal claim was the Lord Protector himself, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. On the 6th of July, 1483, he was crowned King Richard III. The two boys who had been King Edward V and Prince Richard of York were now just Edward and Richard. They were living in the Tower when their uncle took the throne, and then they vanished from history. But if Richard didn't do it, who had the motive to silence two innocent boys? Portrait of a Tyrant. For 500 years, the answer has been simple. Richard III did it. It's the story we all know. The wicked, hunchbacked uncle who would stop at nothing to get the crown. The evidence seems obvious. First, you have motive. To put it mildly, Richard had the strongest motive of anyone on earth. The boys were the only thing standing between him and the throne. He had already declared them illegitimate, but a living, breathing prince is always a threat. Any rival could rally an army, claim the boys were the true kings, and start a civil war. For Richard, eliminating them meant securing his power. It was a brutal but logical move in a brutal time. Second, he had opportunity. He was the king. He controlled the Tower of London. It was his fortress run by his men. No one could get in or out without his permission. He had total access to his nephews. If he wanted them gone, all it took was a quiet order to a loyal servant. The boys would simply disappear, and no one would be able to prove a thing. This is where the story gets dark. The most famous account comes from Sir Thomas More, writing about 30 years later. More wrote that Richard sent a man named James Tyrrell to the tower. Tyrrell, in turn, supposedly hired two men who, in the dead of night, went to the prince's room and smothered them with their pillows. This account is incredibly detailed, full of drama and emotion. It became the official version of events. And then there's the propaganda. This is the kicker. Richard III's reign lasted only 2 years. In 1485, he was defeated and struck down at the Battle of Bosworth Field. The man who took his crown was Henry Tudor, who became King Henry VII. Henry had a very weak claim to the throne. He needed to make sure everyone saw his rule as rightful and Richard's rule as a dark, evil interruption. So what does he do? He launches one of the most successful smear campaigns in history. Henry Tudor's historians, and later William Shakespeare himself, painted Richard as a physical and moral monster. Shakespeare's play, Richard III, shows him as a poisonous bunchback toad, a villain born with teeth, determined to be evil. This was brilliant theater, but it was not history. It was political spin, designed to make the man Henry Tudor had defeated look like a demon. The story of Richard dispatching his nephews was the centerpiece of this entire narrative. For centuries, this was accepted as fact. And then in 1674, nearly 200 years later, the mystery seemed to be solved. Workmen at the Tower of London were demolishing a staircase. Buried deep beneath it, they found a wooden chest. Inside were the skeletons of 2 young children. Everyone assumed this was them. The bones were treated as relics. The king at the time, Charles II, had them placed in an urn and solemnly interred in Westminster Abbey, the final resting place of kings and queens. The case was closed. Richard III was the undisputed monster who had ended his nephews. The story was over. Or was it? The thing is, the case against Richard is entirely circumstantial. There is not one single piece of evidence from his lifetime that proves he did it. All the confessions and eyewitness accounts came after he was gone, written by men working for his enemy, Henry Tudor. Even the bones found in the tower are a problem. They were examined in 1933 and found to be 2 children, roughly the right ages. But no one could prove who they were or when they perished. They could have been from Roman times or any other period. We just don't know. Richard had motive, but the case is circumstantial. What if the real culprit was someone else entirely? A list of enemies. Once you start looking, the list of suspects gets surprisingly long. Many people are crazy about this case because the moment you clear Richard, you see other shadowy figures with blood on their hands. Let's start with suspect number 1. Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham is a fascinating and mysterious figure. He was Richard's right-hand man, his closest ally. He was instrumental in helping Richard get the throne. It was Buckingham who stood by Richard's side, who rallied the lords, and who publicly supported the claim that the princes were illegitimate. Richard rewarded him handsomely with land and power. Then, just 3 months into Richard's reign, Buckingham did something completely baffling. He launched a massive coordinated rebellion to overthrow Richard. And who did he want to put on the throne? Henry Tudor. This switch makes no sense. unless something changed. The theory goes like this. What if Buckingham was the one who arranged for the princes to be eliminated? Why? Well, Buckingham had his own royal blood. He was also a descendant of King Edward III. Maybe he saw the two boys as rivals, not just to Richard, but also to himself. Some historians argue he did it for Richard to prove his loyalty. But a more sinister theory suggests he did it without Richard's knowledge. He could eliminate the princes, let Richard take the blame, and then use the outrage to launch his own rebellion, painting himself as a hero saving England from a monster. He had the opportunity. While Richard was on a royal tour of the kingdom, Buckingham was in London. He had access. The rebellion failed. Richard, who was reportedly stunned by the betrayal, captured Buckingham and had him swiftly executed for treason. Richard never accused him of harming the princes, but the timing is incredibly suspicious. But what about the man Buckingham tried to help? This brings us to suspect number 2, Henry Tudor, King Henry VII. This is the theory many of Richard's defenders, the Ricardians, believe. They argue that the princes were still alive when Richard was defeated at Bosworth Field in 1485. Think about it. If Richard had kept the boys hidden away, maybe in a remote castle, they would have been his ace in the hole. But when Richard perished on the battlefield, the boys would have fallen into the hands of the new king, Henry Tudor. And Henry had an even stronger motive than Richard to get rid of them. Henry's claim to the throne was, to put it mildly, extremely thin. The princes, even if illegitimate, had far more royal blood and popular support. They were a massive threat to Henry's new dynasty. As long as they were alive, his crown was never safe. What's the evidence? It's all about what Henry didn't do. When Henry took the throne, he never launched a public investigation. He never held a trial. He never found the bodies. He never proved Richard did it. He just said so over and over in his official proclamations. Henry also immediately married the prince's oldest sister, Elizabeth of York. This was a smart political move to unite the warring families, but it also meant that his wife was the true heir to the throne, not him. The only way his children could rule without question was if her brothers were gone. For Henry Tudor, the princes were a problem that needed to be erased. He had the motive, and after 1485, he had the opportunity. There's even a third and perhaps more chilling suspect, Margaret Beaufort. She was Henry Tudor's mother, a quiet, fiercely religious woman who spent her entire life maneuvering to get her son on the throne. She was the true political mastermind of the family. Some historians wonder if this ambitious woman, who would stop at nothing, was the one who gave the order. But one historian, before his passing, rejected all of these. He pointed to a suspect no one expected. The real culprit named. This is where the story takes its most dramatic turn. The title of this video is about a historian's final revelation. That historian was David Baldwin, a highly respected medievalist at the University of Leicester. Before he passed away in 2016, he published his research on this very mystery, and his conclusion was a bombshell. In his book, The Lost Princes, The Fates of the Two Princes in the Tower and the Tudor Taboo, Baldwin systematically re-examined every single piece of evidence. He didn't just rehash the old arguments. He looked at the hard, cold facts, and he came to a conclusion that stunned the historical community. He argued that both Richard III and Henry Tudor were innocent. Baldwin believed the princes did indeed perish in the summer of 1483, right when everyone lost sight of them. This means Henry Tudor couldn't have done it. He was in exile in France. And it means the boys were gone before Richard was defeated at Bosworth. But Baldwin's key argument was that Richard III, while ruthless, was not the one who gave the order. So who was it? David Baldwin's final theory points the finger directly back at Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. But Baldwin's theory has a critical twist that no one had ever fully explored. He didn't think Buckingham was trying to frame Richard, and he didn't think he was doing it for Richard. Baldwin argued that Buckingham did it for himself. You see, Buckingham's claim to the throne was in his own mind just as strong as Richard's. He was a direct descendant of King Edward III, just like Richard. What many overlooked is that Buckingham wasn't just an ally, he was a rival. Here is the timeline Baldwin laid out. In July of 1483, Richard III is crowned. He is popular. He immediately leaves London for a grand royal tour of his new kingdom, a journey that would take months and cover hundreds of miles. He leaves one man in charge of the capital, his trusted friend, the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham is now in London. The king is hundreds of miles away. The two young princes are locked in the tower. Baldwin's theory is that this is when Buckingham made his move. He saw his chance to clear the board. With Richard out of the way, Buckingham could secretly arrange for the princes to be eliminated. His plan was simple. Get rid of the boys, let the rumor of their disappearance leak out, and let everyone assume Richard did it. This would destroy Richard's reputation. The man who had just been celebrated as a hero would now be seen as a monster. And that's exactly what happened. In the fall, rumors began to swirl that the princes were gone. The support for Richard began to crack. And who was right there to pick up the pieces? The Duke of Buckingham, who suddenly launched his rebellion in October. Baldwin argues that Buckingham's rebellion wasn't a sudden change of heart. It was his endgame. He planned to march his army, expose Richard as a monster, and with the princes gone, claim the throne for himself. He only backed Henry Tudor as a plan B to get other nobles on his side. This theory is brilliant because it answers all the big questions. It explains why the rebellion happened so suddenly. It explains why Richard seemed so genuinely shocked by Buckingham's betrayal. And most of all, it explains the one piece of evidence that has always puzzled Ricardians. If Richard was innocent, why didn't he just parade the boys through London to prove the rumors were lies? Baldwin's answer is devastating. Richard couldn't. He was on his royal tour when Buckingham acted. By the time Richard heard the rumors and returned to London, his nephews were already gone. He was trapped. He couldn't produce the boys, but he also couldn't prove who did it. He probably suspected Buckingham, which is why he had him executed so fast for treason, but accusing him publicly would just confirm that the princes were gone, making him look even more guilty. Richard III in this version isn't the villain. He's the victim of the ultimate betrayal. This theory paints Richard as a victim. But what about the final piece of evidence? What the science says. David Baldwin's theory is powerful. It's compelling. It's neat. It paints a vivid picture of a king, Richard III, trapped not by his own monstrous ambition, but by the ambition of his closest friend, the Duke of Buckingham. It's a theory that takes the cartoon villain Shakespeare gave us and turns him into a tragic, complex human being. A man backed into a corner who may have been framed for a crime he never intended to commit. It's a story that feels right to a lot of people. It explains the why. Why would Richard eliminated the very nephews he had sworn to protect? Maybe he didn't. Maybe it was the man standing right next to him, the man with his own distant claim to the throne, who saw an opportunity. But is it all true? Is it that simple? Are we just trading one convenient story for another? Are we missing a key detail? The thing is, this entire 500-year-old mystery, this whole debate, the Shakespearean monster versus the tragic victim, all of it could be solved. It could be ended definitively with one simple test. To understand why, we have to go back. Let's go back to those bones. Imagine this. It's 1674. The Tower of London, that ancient grim fortress, is undergoing renovations. Workers are busy pulling down an old staircase, one that leads to the chapel. It's dirty work, pulling apart stone and timber that's been sitting there for centuries. And then their tools hit something. Not stone, something softer. Wood. They clear away the rubble and they find a rotten wooden chest. And inside that chest are the skeletons of two small children. The news spreads like wildfire. King Charles II, the reigning monarch, hears of the discovery. He immediately jumps to a conclusion, the same one everyone else was thinking. It's them. It's the princes. These, he declared, were the long-lost remains of Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, the two boys who had vanished from that very tower back in 1483. He ordered the bones to be treated with the respect they were denied in life. They were placed in a marble urn and given a royal burial in one of the most sacred places in England, Westminster Abbey. And there they sat, for centuries. Case closed. The princes were found. Flash forward to 1933. The urn is opened. For the first time, scientists get to look at the remains. They examine the bones, the teeth, they measure them, and they come to a conclusion. Yes, these bones are consistent with the ages of the two lost princes, so the urn was sealed back up, the key was turned. And for the better part of a century, that was that. The bones in the urn were the princes, and the man who put them there was, as the story went, their wicked uncle, Richard III. But that 1933 examination, by our standards today, it was basic. They didn't have the tools we have. They couldn't test for DNA. They couldn't perform high-precision carbon dating. They made an educated guess. A very good guess, maybe, but a guess nonetheless. And that guess is now locked away, sealed in stone, in the heart of the British establishment. For decades, it seemed like that would be the end of the story. The mystery would remain a mystery. The bones were locked up, and the chief suspect, Richard III, was lost to history. His body dumped in an unmarked grave after his defeat at the Battle of Bosworth. We had the story. We had the bones. But we could never connect the two. Then, in 2012, something incredible happened. Something that changes everything. In a stunning piece of archaeological detective work, a team led by a researcher named Philippa Langley, part of the Missing Princes project, decided to follow a hunch. Langley was a Ricardian, one of the many people who believed Richard III was innocent. She was driven by a feeling, a deep-seated belief that the history books were wrong. She had old maps, she had theories, and she pointed to a specific unremarkable spot in a boring gray parking lot in the city of Leicester. A spot that was just a parking space. She said, "Dig here." The experts scoffed. The media thought it was a joke. Digging for a lost king in a parking lot? It sounded insane. And then the sound of a shovel hitting bone. They found him. Buried in a hasty, shallow grave, unceremoniously dumped after the battle, was a skeleton. This skeleton had the battle wounds of a warrior, and it had a curved spine. Not the monstrous hunchback of Shakespeare's plays, but a severe case of scoliosis. This was him. After more than 500 years, King Richard III had been found. This discovery was more than just finding a lost king. It was like finding the key to a 500-year-old lock. Scientists at the University of Leicester were able to do what seemed impossible. They carefully, painstakingly extracted ancient DNA from the bones. They found Richard's mitochondrial DNA, a special kind of genetic code that is passed down almost unchanged from a mother to her children. To prove it was him, they tracked down a living descendant of Richard's sister, a man named Michael Ibsen. They tested his DNA against the DNA from the skeleton. It was a match. It was official. We now have King Richard III's genetic code. This is the key. This is the moment the entire mystery pivots. Think about it. We have Richard's DNA. Richard was the prince's uncle. They all shared a common female ancestor, their grandmother, Cecily Neville. This means the princes must carry the same mitochondrial DNA as their uncle Richard. The puzzle pieces are all on the table. We have the locked box, the urn in Westminster Abbey, holding the bones of two children who are supposed to be the princes. And now we have the key, the confirmed 100% authentic DNA of the man accused of their murder. A simple DNA test could finally, after 5 centuries of rumor, propaganda, and speculation, answer the question. Here is what that test would tell us. It's a 2-part investigation. Part 1, identity. First, are those bones in the urn even the prince's? A simple DNA comparison would tell us yes or no. If the DNA is a match for Richard's, we know those are the boys. If it's not a match, well, then the entire mystery is blown wide open. It would mean that for over 300 years, the royal family has been honoring the remains of 2 unknown children. And if those aren't the princes, then where are they? What really happened to them? But let's assume the DNA is a match. Let's say the test confirms, yes, these are Edward and Richard. That's when we move to part 2. And this is the big one. Carbon dating. Modern radiocarbon dating is incredibly precise. It can tell us with a very small margin of error when a person died. And when these boys died is the entire question. This test would give us a date, and that date would point the finger of blame directly and indisputably at the monster. Think of the scenarios. Scenario A. The carbon dating shows the boys died in 1483, between the summer and fall of that year. If that's the result, the case is closed. In 1483, only 2 men had the opportunity, the means, and the motive: King Richard III and his friend, the Duke of Buckingham. It would confirm that the Tudor version of history, the story Shakespeare told, was essentially correct. Richard, or his closest ally, was a child eliminator. But then, there's scenario B. What if the carbon dating shows the boys died after August of 1485? What if they were still alive when Richard III rode out to Bosworth Field? What if they were still alive when he was cut down and a new man seized the crown? If the boys died after 1485, Richard III is innocent. He couldn't have done it. He was already dead. And in that case, there is only one suspect: the new king, Henry Tudor, King Henry VII, the man who married the prince's sister, the man who founded the entire Tudor dynasty, the grandfather of Elizabeth I, the ancestor of the entire modern royal line, right down to the current king. This is what's at stake. A simple test could prove that the founder of Britain's most celebrated royal dynasty was a fraud, a usurper, and a murderer who built his throne on the most horrific crime imaginable. The answer is right there. The science is ready. The historians are waiting. The Missing Princes Project and researchers from around the world have lined up, formally petitioning for access. We have the technology. We have the comparison. Let us solve this. Let us finally find the truth. But there's one problem. The Church of England and the royal family have refused all requests to test the bones. Every single request has been met with a polite but unyielding no. The late Queen Elizabeth II herself reportedly denied the request multiple times. The Church of England, which controls Westminster Abbey, stands by that decision. To this day, the urn remains sealed. The one piece of evidence that could solve the mystery is off limits. And this is where the real mystery begins. Why? The official reason given is a simple and pious one: respect for the dead. These are, they argue, the remains of 2 children buried in consecrated ground. They are at peace. To open their tomb, to disturb their rest, simply to satisfy our historical curiosity. It would be a desecration. It's a violation of a sacred burial. And that sounds reasonable. It sounds respectful. But is it the real reason? Many people are furious about this. They see it as an obstruction of justice. They wonder, is the monarchy, is the establishment afraid of what the test might reveal? Let's play this out. What is the worst-case scenario for the crown? What if the bones aren't the prince's? That would be a massive embarrassment. It would mean that one of the most famous royal tombs in their most sacred abbey is a fake. It would mean that for centuries they've been honoring 2 random skeletons found by workmen. That's bad. But the other possibility is so much worse. What if the DNA is a match, and the carbon dating points to Henry Tudor? What if the test proves, scientifically, that the founder of their line, the man who provides the very legitimacy for their crown, was the real monster? That he murdered the rightful king, Edward V, and his brother? It would rewrite history. It would stain the crown forever. Suddenly, respect for the dead starts to sound a lot like, don't look in the closet. And so here we are, trapped in a 500-year-old stalemate. The answer is literally feet away, locked in a stone box in Westminster Abbey. But we are forbidden from looking. So who do you believe is the real culprit? Richard, Buckingham, or Henry Tudor? Is this the greatest cover-up in history? Let us know your theory in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more hidden histories.